Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
At the top of the news again this week, in the wake of the Iranian strikes against Israel last weekend, and then Israel's drone strikes in retaliation at the end of the week. We asked Ambassador Richard Haass of Centerview Partners and author of the newsletter Home and Away how much escalation we could see.
We're potentially into a cycle of escalation, not definitely. And if it were to happen, I think the most obvious area, other than the emotional reaction to violence there, would be, do the Iranians take steps to close down the Straits of Hormuz?
Did the calculus change, even if subtly, with the role, whether tacit or active, of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Jordan? Because in retrospect, there are reports that, in fact, that helped with the Israeli defenses, which I think may be something different in that region.
It does, and it shows you just how alienated they are from Iran and how worried they are about the Iranian threat. But at the same time, when Iran is not front and center, and if we cycle back to Gaza or the West Bank, it's difficult for these countries to move closer to Israel, given their differences over the Palestinian issue. So you've almost got a Middle East now that's operating along different fault lines, the Israeli-Iranian one directly, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in the north, which has gotten worse in the last few days between Israel and Hezbollah.
Many of us follow the news carefully, whether on TV or reading the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, but much of what's going on we don't see. It's below the surface, as it were. You were part of that when you were in the State Department with Colin Powell. You've been in those rooms. Give us some sense of what you think may be going on that we don't know about, and particularly what the U.S. role is or should be in this.
Well, the big thing is the U.S. is trying to be reassuring to Israel. At the same time, they're trying to urge them not to respond against Iran. The parallel here, David, is when I was at the White House in 1991. It was the opening days of the Gulf War. Iraqi Scuds were landing on Israel. And we, the Bush administration, Bush 41, prevailed upon the Israelis not to retaliate directly against Iraq. We were worried that could break apart this coalition we had built. But we were in a very strong position then. We had 500,000 American men and women in uniform over in the Middle East. We were at the center of it. The Biden administration does not have that kind of influence over Israel right now. So I think its hand is somewhat weaker.
Turn for a moment, if you would, to Ukraine. There are a lot of reports that the Russians are really putting more and more pressure on Ukrainian forces in the east of the country. And we have this debate going on in the United States and efforts in Europe to try to give more support to Ukraine. How bad is the situation, do you think?
It's bad. It's getting worse. The shortages of munitions, the shortages of equipment it's frustrating. It's tragic. It's irresponsible. Let's be honest. Hopefully, the House of Representatives will correct this and reopen the spigot of aid to Ukraine. And if they do, Ukraine will not be able to liberate Crimea or the eastern lands, but they'll be able to hold the Russians at bay, as they've pretty much done for the best part of the last 2 years. So this is critical. This is critical not just for Ukraine, but for stability in Europe. And this is critical really for stability in the world. Chinese are taking note what we're doing here, and people are judging the United States. You know, when you're a great power, you don't have the luxury of doing things in isolation. What you do on one square of the chessboard affects inevitably how you're perceived by friends and foes alike everywhere else.
Richard, you always take a strategic view of these things, not just tactical. But given what you just said about Ukraine, at this point, realistically, are we, if I can put us together with Ukraine and the Western world, are we playing for a tie rather than a win? As you said, it's unlikely that Ukraine anytime soon is going to liberate the eastern part of the country.
Look, tie is not as good as a win, but it's a hell of a lot better than a loss. And I believe, given Russia's scale, given its war economy, the best Ukraine can get for the foreseeable future through military force is a tie. Then I think over time, and this may have to wait, David, beyond Vladimir Putin, I think Ukraine, if it has close ties to the EU, close ties to NATO, we continue to arm it, can play for a win, not through military liberation, but through diplomacy and the use of economic coercion. So you almost need to break this down in phases. For the foreseeable future, let's get a tie. Let's get a situation where Ukraine can continue to exist as a viable, successful country, where Putin is frustrated. Then over time, we can get Ukraine what's rightfully theirs.
So, Richard, we, of course, try to address long-term investors, big-time investors here at Bloomberg. Give us your best advice that you would give to investors right now. You talk about the Middle East. You talk about Ukraine. By the way, we haven't mentioned China, with now new tariffs on Chinese steel coming in an election year. And we have an election year, which itself may pose some real issues for the United States and even for financial markets. If you're an investor, what do you need to have on your dashboard? What do you need to be most concerned about?
You need to have a seatbelt and keep it fastened, David, more than anything else. Look, you've got the two parties competing over how tough they can be on China, over protectionism to some extent, which is all problematic and obviously has all sorts of consequences for inflation. The pressure will be to tighten flows across the border, whatever, even though that's a good thing, I would argue, in terms of security. Also, again, that could add to inflationary pressures if we suddenly don't have so much labor that's available. I worry, David, about the 75 days between Election Day and Inauguration Day. That's the period 4 years ago when January 6th happened. Imagine this is a close contest. Imagine we have not just division and dysfunction, but political violence. A lot of people around the world could get unnerved. A lot of foes around the world might see that as a moment of opportunity. And then again, after Inauguration Day, will we be functional or dysfunctional? Is what's happening over this aid bill, is that an exception to the rule? Or will that be the rule after the election? So I think there's lots of issues. And obviously, if Mr. Trump were to win, does he try to undo a lot of the architecture in the world that has served this country well over 75 years? So if you're an investor, there's a degree of uncertainty, this combination of geopolitics in the world against the backdrop of America that's no longer certain or united as to its role. This is actually the most dangerous moment, I would argue, not just since the end of the Cold War, but in many ways since the end of World War II.
And you talk about that, as I recall, in your most recent book, Bill of Obligations. And I guess my question, to try to end on something of a hopeful note, do you see any progress? You talk about the risks and the dissension and the real danger for the fundamentals of our democracy. Are you seeing any progress at all?
Well, I see lots of progress. You just had the visit of the Japanese prime minister. Look how robust Japan is and this alliance is. We've seen the improvement in ties between Japan and South Korea. We see India doing pretty well economically. So, yeah, I see some positive things around the world. What's happened in Ukraine until recently? The fact that the United States and Europe were willing and able to step up to make Ukraine, help put Ukraine in a position where it could frustrate Russian aggression and ambitions. That was pretty impressive. So to me, the biggest single question is whether we come together, or at a minimum, avoid really severe dysfunction and violence during those critical 75 days after the election, that we see no reprise of January 6th. Then afterwards, we'll see who's sitting in the Oval Office, who's controlling the House and the Senate. Can we essentially govern? I don't have a crystal ball, but all I know is, David, that so much depends upon our role in the world. The world is not self-ordering, self-organizing. We have got to play a large role. And the real question is whether we're able to. And I would say the people watching this show, they have a big stake in this. The rule of law here at home, a stable world. This provides the context for everything American business does. So I would basically say to CEOs and others, they ought to really think hard about what they could do to influence to make this election, in the sense of make it easy for their people to vote, give them opportunities to get informed, to support policies that are pro-democracy here at home and pro-internationalist in the world. They have an enormous stake in that.